I talk about Superman a lot on this channel, or at least I try to. I'm trying to do it more. I always want to talk about Superman. He's a character very near and dear to me. The problem is, every time I seem to click record to talk about Superman, it's always about something about the public's general indifference to him. And that makes me sad, but that's also kind of like my mission here, is just like, no, look, he's awesome, please notice me. And to kind of like emphasize that, something I've noticed a lot, even in comic book fandom, isn't really talked about a lot, is when you see people mention like the Great Rogues Gallery in comics. It's Flash, Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, the X-Men, even the Fantastic Four have got a good one, but no one ever really mentioned Superman's Rogues Gallery, despite it probably being one of the longest running and fleshed out of the bunch. And I kind of want to address that and see maybe where that comes from, and if there's anything DC could do to maybe fix it. And to kind of join that, I've brought in my own arch nemesis. He's conspired to kill me and blow up the multiverse many times, but I've thwarted him at every step of the way. And now, as punishment, he's doing public service by appearing on my channel. If anyone followed me on Twitter there's some heavy lore for you right there.
Yeah, that's
yes.
2 years of timeline.
As you heard by their sultry tones, Mo is joining me once again. How are you, man?
I'm good. Hello, everyone. Really glad to be here. Again, talking about the villains this time, because every time we talk about this, the big blue sky, the big man, but now we get to get down to the dirty, the villains, see what he really has to go up against.
And boy, will we get dirty, because I'm about to start talking about a very smooth, white, clean-shaven surface, which you can reflect light off, aka Mr. Lex Luthor. So I feel like I'll open this with like the one that's like universally praised, but it's seemingly just him. Lex is a character that nearly every person says, oh, he's a fantastic villain, probably one of the greatest supervillains of all time. Even people who don't like Superman seem to like Lex Luthor because they agree with him. So I'm just like, Mo, how do you feel? What makes Lex stand out compared to the other Superman villains? Why has he ran to the top of the peak?
I think what I love about Lex, like before getting into like his actual character, I love the fact that Superman's greatest villain is just a normal dude. He's just a guy. He's not like every superhero has their kind of like the opposite. So even Superman has General Zod, but Flash has Reverse Flash, Green Lantern has Sinestro, and so on. But Superman's like #1 greatest villain, he's just a guy. He doesn't have any superpowers, and he still manages to go toe-to-toe with the Man of Steel. And that's like the most interesting aspect to me. And that bleeds into like his characterization, and the fact that he's human is basically what defines his entire motivation as a character and his deep hatred for the superhuman Superman.
And I think that's very well put, because I feel like that's the key as to why Luthor's heralded so well. Not only is he fantastically written and present in nearly every great Superman story, and kind of the ultimate bad guy in the way that Superman is the ultimate superhero, I feel like it's also just... I've mentioned prior that the reason why I feel like Batman's villains get a lot of shine is because they have such a psychological basis. Like the Riddler, when you write a Riddler story, you have to put more effort in simply because you have to think of riddles. Like even the worst writer will probably make a good Riddler story if they really tried, because it's just an interesting concept that you have to put effort in. Luthor kind of has that, because no matter who you are, and no matter how much you dislike Superman or whatever, it is interesting seeing Superman fight a regular guy. You have to come up with schemes that are more creative, that are more interesting than just a punch-up. Sometimes it devolves to a punch-up when, like, the laziest thing people can do is, oh, let's put Luthor in a power armor. Whereas the most interesting Lex is the Lex who never comes to blow with Superman. The closest they get to a fight is him talking to him in his office and, like, saying, well, you stopped my plan, but you still can't touch me, so suck it, alien. So that kind of Lex is kind of the ultimate epitome of, like, the supervillain. And I think it's also why, compared to that, and why Lex succeeds, you get the people like General Zod or Brainiac, who kind of fall into the more... Yes, they're recognizable, but they also don't get as much praise because they're so easy to write as their stereotypes. You can easily write Brainiac as just generic alien invasion story that you've seen 1,000 times, and nearly every Brainiac story turns into that. General Zod is the same way. You can write General Zod as just generic dictator supervillain who's also a dick. I guess I'll just ask you that, Mo, is like, do you agree that the reason why Lex is like at the top is because he's inherently an idea you have to put more effort in than compared to his contemporaries?
Yeah, definitely. And I think because Lex kind of like each enemy of Superman, I think maybe not all of them, but like a select few, they each kind of mirror an aspect of Superman himself. Because if you take like General Zod and Luthor, General Zod is kind of like the more towards the Kryptonian side of Superman, because if Superman under other circumstances, you could see Superman being General Zod, or at least agreeing with him. So he represents kind of that world, because Superman is of two worlds, and Zod represents one world, and Luthor represents more the human side. And that's a really like cool like juxtaposition that we have between Zod and Luthor, is that each of them kind of pull Superman towards a certain way, because you see like with New Krypton and all the stories of Superman being really kind of drawn towards his Kryptonian side more, we see a different Superman. But with Luthor, we kind of also see a more human Superman when dealing with him, because Superman can't fight Luthor as Kal-El. He needs to fight him as kind of not as Clark Kent, but as the good person in Superman. You could have an incredible Superman Lex story without any of them even throwing a punch. Uh-huh. And that's a really cool idea, because you don't need Lex, as you said, you don't need Lex to be like the fighting man. He doesn't need to be in a big green power suit with his head exposed for no reason. You can just you can just have a really cool ideological battle, because Lex really he's just such a symbol of hatred and envy. And I think Lex's envy of Superman and Superman's, because Lex is envious of Superman of something that Superman doesn't think that he is. And that's a really cool like misunderstanding that breeds conflict between the two.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also like I think if you had to like get them down to their base components, is Superman is the best of humanity, and whereas Lex Luthor is the worst of humanity. But at the end of the day, they both represent human emotions. Superman can inspire us, while Lex Luthor is always present, because it's like the yin and yang. We as humans can't be as good as Superman, but at the same time, we don't want to be as evil as Lex. But we can understand both of them, because everyone's had that petty mentality sometimes. You see a rich person or celebrity and you think, they don't deserve that. I worked much harder than they did and they get all of that. It's not fair. God damn them. Like, that feeling in your gut, that's Lex Luthor. And that has some power to it. That has like an eternal lasting impact that will be here long after we're dead. There'll still be telling Lex Luthor stories because he's just that good of a villain to really heighten our perspective of human emotion, in the same way that Superman is just the act. It doesn't matter about the powers, it's just the act of kindness and the act of being selfless, whereas Luthor is 100% selfish. But going into the other villains, we kind of... I think... Alright, here's a question then, just to kind of praise this. Mo, if you had to like name off the most iconic Superman villains, let's just say top 7, who would they be?
Luthor, Zod.
Doesn't have to be your favorites,
Brainiac.
just has to be like the most known.
Yeah, like Metallo, you have Zod, you have Toyman. I love Toyman. You have Kryptonite Man. Oh god, it's really like the Superman villains. They always kind of really put me on the spot here, but
I'll cover you if you need to. All right, I'll
just
this would be my
Doomsday,
list.
Darkseid, kind of. Really, there's just a lot of them, and they're all great. They're just kind of Manchester Black, the entire elite, because they only appeared in like few stories, but still, like they instantly made it to the top.
I feel like that's a really good example I just recorded of why the Superman villains need more exposure because of this. If I asked him about Batman villains, he wouldn't have this problem. Yet he's more of a Superman fan than he's a Batman fan, and that tells you a lot, folks, about what DC needs to start getting the game on. All right, so for me, it'd be like Lex Luthor, Brainiac, Zod, Doomsday, Toyman, Parasite, Bizarro, freaking Mixie Spitlick. The problem is when you just listen, we forget what you said. And then I feel like another one important, even if he isn't necessarily a Superman villain, I think he works really, really well as one, is Darkseid.
Yeah.
Those would be like the basis of like, okay, if you have to have like a Superman Rose Gallery, those would be my initial picks. I like Metallo as well. So like we get that. The problem is, as we and Mo have mentioned previously, DC has a very hard time adapting or just telling Superman stories because a lot of the time they're very embarrassed of Superman because they don't necessarily don't like him. It's just they don't know what to do with him, and sometimes they think he's the not cool guy that they need to revamp. The problem is that they spend so many times revamping Superman and doing all these different things with Superman, trying to work out his character. There is barely any time to give that kind of attention and focus to the villains.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
why you repeat the same Superman versus Luthor story, because that's the most iconic and that's normally the origin. Most Superman stories then don't get past the origin before like something else happens. Most people do a Doomsday because the death of Superman is also the next famous story after the origin. And maybe he'll fight Darkseid in the Justice League. Everyone else, you'll be lucky if they get a decent story with, because DC is so, like, trying to get Superman right, there's no time for the villains. And I guess, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think you made an excellent point of repeating the same story over and over, because you really have... We've seen Superman versus Lex a million times, and while they find new ways and new angles to have a more interesting story, but I'd rather kind of lay off Luthor for a bit. Zod, Zod, I feel like he skyrocketed into popularity recently because there was a long stretch of time where there was barely any Zod stories. But then suddenly Zod is like in everything now. I think Brainiac is kind of getting more exposure as well. But the others are just like, when was the last time you read a good Toyman story?
Yeah.
I really can't remember. I thought the same about Mrs. Pitlick, but then we had the whole like Superman Reborn thing with the fake Clark Kent, and I really liked that. I really liked how they incorporated Mrs. Pitlick into that. But at the same time, the others are just, why aren't they getting the spotlight? Why can't you make like a massive Superman story with Metallo or Bizarro, or like even Doomsday is kind of just getting thrown into the same type of story every time since the death of Superman. And the problem is he's kind of a very one-note character. He doesn't have much to do other than just fight Superman. While someone like, yeah, go on.
All right, but I don't want to interrupt your point, but I think on the Doomsday thing is very important, because here you have a villain who rocketed in probably the most publicized, famous comic ever written. Like it was in the news. People were crying over this in real life. Like this was one of the only times the public seriously gave a shit about Superman. And what was the villain they star in that is Grey Hulk. Grey Hulk, but less personality than the Hulk. And then he's been that ever since. And that's such a missed opportunity to get the public's attention and like really give them a story I've ever seen. And I think we'll never get that moment back. Like imagine how things might have been different if that story wasn't, if that Death of Superman story was instead just All-Star Superman and it got that kind of attention. Things would have changed forever.
Yeah, definitely. And I think an interesting point to bring up is how diverse the Superman's rogues gallery are. Because you mentioned Batman having the most popular, and people think Batman has the best rogues gallery, and of course that's debatable. But Batman's rogues gallery kind of all fall into the same, like kind of under the same category of they're all either crazy or represent like the dark and gritty part of Gotham. And at some point it just, I love Batman, I love the Batman's villains, but at some point it becomes a bit too similar. Flash, if you exclude Reverse Flash and Grodd, maybe, you have the Rogues, who are an incredible team, but also kind of fall under the same category of having, like, if you have like 10 issues and each issue is just Flash fighting a different Rogue, it's going to be interesting, like power-wise, but it's not going to offer like much difference or much variety. While you have Superman, where every single villain is not like the other. Yeah. You have Zod, who's the reverse Superman. You have Luthor, who's the intellectual human enemy of Superman. You have Bizarro, who was a really inventive character. And I think like Bizarro is one of the most creative characters ever created, and DC doesn't really do much with him. You have Mrs. Pitt, like another really creative character, and they all kind of fall under different categories of different themes. Whereas characters like Batman or Spider-Man or Flash, each villain, like they kind of have very similar tones.
I think that's a really good point that even I didn't think of. It is just like we could have so many different stories of so many different types with Superman, and especially the weirder villains, and every issue could be completely different. Like Metallo's plots will always be completely different than what of insanity Bizarro comes up with, and that could give really interesting, really diverse stories that Superman could tackle. Yet we don't do that. Instead, we kind of default to the villains that they're to be punched, and then he saves the day, or like they threaten something and then they're knocked out, and then that's it. And it feels like such a waste of potential, because like really none of Superman's villains are gonna want to rob her back. Like even Toyman isn't out it for money, he's out to like prove a point. Even someone like the Prankster who's like hired by Intergang to make distractions for Superman while criminals do other things. Like that's a really clever idea for a superhero villain, and yet we barely see him. Like, stuff like this is just, I feel like just to put a cap on everything, as Superman's villains, yes, on the surface, as they currently are not the greatest rogues gallery. They're simply not developed enough and don't have enough iconic stories given to them that you could ever justifiably say that. I think that's completely fair. Yeah, even as being a big Superman stan, admitting that. However, I will say that Superman's rogues gallery has the most potential out of every single superhero's rogues gallery ever, and we really need to capitalize on that.
Yeah, exactly. And also, just adding to that, we've talked about how they've kind of been outtrodden by DC in comics, but like in other media, which kind of does really present the characters to the more general audience. Because if you think like the people who love the Batman Rogues Gallery, it's not just like everybody kind of, or not everybody, but most people kind of agree that Batman has the best Rogues Gallery. And I'd say a good some of these people aren't really comic fans. They love the movies and the especially Batman the animated series and the video games and all that. Superman's villains don't have that same kind of, what's the word? Yeah, exactly. In movies, we've only ever had Lex and Zod. It's been Lex and Zod since Superman 1 in 1978.
Which is crazy.
Exactly. And it's not even like we've never like I love Gene Hackman, but we've never had a definitive Lex on screen. I think the closest that's ever gotten to that was Michael Rosenbaum and Smallville, and Smallville maybe wasn't the best circumstance, but we've never had the perfect Lex Luthor. And even like beyond that, we don't get any more villains, because if you exclude Smallville, because it had like every single Superman villain ever, most Superman villains just aren't on screen. Now like Supergirl is using the Superman villains more than the Superman movies ever did. It was crazy to me that watching Superman on the show fighting Metallo, I was thinking, this is the first time I've ever seen Superman fight Metallo in live action.
Which is insane.
And why? It's insane to me. And even on Smallville, like he wasn't Superman yet, so it doesn't really count. But at that point, we had never seen Superman and Metallo fight each other. We'd never seen Superman and Brainiac even in the same room. And why? Like, why don't we get that same publicity for the Superman villains?
I think it is just down to Superman himself not getting the publicity. So, of course, the villains are going to suffer even more. And unfortunately, given DC's current plans, it seems we're still going to be a long, long time until we get that like definitive on-screen interpretation of Superman fighting these villains in his own movie, which sucks. It really does. But hopefully we'll see some change. Hopefully this is maybe like any writers, DC, if you manage to somehow in a drunken binge find your way onto this channel and listen to this video all the way through, please just give the Superman villains some love. They're really, really good. And just an animated series or anything, or just give Tyler Hoechlin his own show, and he'll let him fight all the villains that were on Supergirl, but like just do them a little bit better, and it'll be fantastic. Or get him to fight the Brainiac from Krypton or something. It'll be just the best.
Speaking of, we have like John Cryer's Lex Luthor, showing up for the first time in 2 weeks, and I'm really holding out hope for that. So please be good, because he could be like the best Lex ever. Like the bar isn't very high.
Exactly, which is a massive shame for some of the greatest villains in comics, especially the greatest villain in comics to me, Mr. Luthor himself. But yes, speaking of great villains, I couldn't have done this without the one and only arch nemesis, Reverse Alfie, aka Mo. Thank you for joining me onto this, man.
Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next crisis, I hope.
Hopefully, don't kill any of my loved ones while we're there, because that's getting an overdone trope. But yes, if you'd like to also join us in the next crisis and fight against the evil hordes of Mo, or join him to defeat this one British asshole named Alfie, you can just subscribe down below and just make sure you listen to more content. We're going to be regular with this, and we've got a good flow going, and we can't wait to get it out to all of you. So yes, thank you for listening, and take it easy, folks.